Hello, everyone, and welcome to another week of This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park, joined as always by Charlie Araujo. How are you today, Charlie?
Oh, I am doing great. I'm living on no sleep for a variety of reasons, including my toddler. I am in Nashville this week visiting family, which is nice, a nice change of pace. And I actually want to start with a little bit of a shout out. And in full disclosure, these are companies that I'm talking about working with. I'm not working
Sure.
with them now. But I love to point out when companies are actually getting things right. We spend a lot of time on this podcast, I feel like, talking about when companies sort of blow it. um, and so one of these companies, it's all about their AR program. And
Mhm.
I just think that, and we've talked in the past about Zoho. This company's Logic Monitor. Zoho does a fabulous job with their comms and the AR and Sandy, and we all love her. And I feel like Logic Monitor is starting to fall into that same category. Incredibly responsive, incredibly attentive, understanding. I don't know if you saw Liz Miller, who's a constellation analyst, posted this anonymous sort of, not, I mean, she wasn't anonymous, it was from her, but like she didn't name who inspired this, but basically how to blow a briefing. We've all been
Mhm.
through these, right? And so when a
Right.
company is really putting the focus and energy on it, it actually changes the way you interact with them in a very positive way, and it shows why investments in AR can really pay off. And I think Logic Monitor and Brandon over there in particular is just doing a great job with that. um, and then the other is a company called Camunda. They do business process orchestration. And again, talking about potentially doing some work with them. And so they sent me a deck, which was their like messaging framework. And man, it was such a treat to actually see somebody that had their messaging nailed. They knew exactly what they were trying to say. They knew exactly why they were saying it. They knew who they were saying it to, and they had this well
Mhm.
orchestrated, and it makes the world a difference. And so, I love when people are doing sort of the right thing. That I just wanted to give them props on both fronts, just because I think, regardless of whether or not I end up working with them, I just think they're doing great stuff. So, for what it's worth.
It's great that you got to say one nice thing uh, today. So now that we got that out of the way, we can get
Now
into
let's go.
analyzing everybody else.
All right, let's do it.
Excellent. So obviously, one of the biggest things that in has happened in tech in recent history happened last week with the United States officially considering Google to be a monopoly in search, and now there's a lot of discussion on what this means for anybody who's a Google customer, which frankly is just about everyone on Earth in either directly or indirectly. CIOs are no exception. And we have to start thinking about what aspects of Google actually impact the enterprise and how we are going to be affected from a technology and business perspective. So it's interesting to think about because the last time any breakup of this size was considered was really when Microsoft almost had to be broken up once upon a time to figure out if the OS and Office would be allowed to stick around together, and they did. But we'll see what happens this time around.
So I think we there's a whole bunch of different perspectives that we have to look at this from. The first is, I think that most, particularly when it comes to tech, most of the antitrust laws, particularly those in the US, are just completely antiquated and ill-equipped to really address the situation. Google has unquestionable dominance in search today, but they are not a monopoly in the way that antitrust was originally designed to address, right? Where they were artificially sort of creating this environment. Now they did the finding here was they acted illegally, and I don't think the actual U.S. District Court judge's ruling specifically called out the Apple relationship, but the Apple relationship and others like it with Samsung and others are really the core of it, because the idea there is by paying them this massive amount of money, it becomes the default search engine, and therefore people use it. But all that really speaks to the fact that we as consumers are lemmings. It's because, I mean, just because Apple set the default search engine to Google doesn't mean we are in fact captive. I have been off of Google search. I've been using DuckDuckGo for a long time. There's many other forms out there. And so I think that there's some misguidedness to this. But what is the relevance from my perspective if you're a CIO? I think the greatest relevance is that Google search dominance, so I'm not going to call it a monopoly, but their search dominance has been the fuel that funded their experimentation in all of these other areas. And you've talked in the past about how they will abandon them very quickly because they sort of don't care, and that's a problem. But one of the ways is their very large investments in their cloud offering that competes with Microsoft and Amazon. And I would argue that we need them, interestingly enough, to compete with Microsoft and Amazon. We need that third major player. And I would argue that their search dominance has helped subsidize that and help them be competitive and to play. And I actually think this could in fact be a negative thing for if you put on the CIO lens, because it could in fact negatively impact their ability to compete depending on which way this goes. So I get the concern about monopolistic actions, and I think probably, removing some of that as it relates to the Apple relationship, and so it's probably a good thing. But I think we need to. I'm not sure this is as good of a thing as some people seem to be like running out going, yeah, look, we're going to break these big bad guys up.
Yeah, I'm torn about it because I do think Google is a monopoly in search, and I do think there's room for some sort of competition in the search world. Perplexity is starting to show that there is room to actually improve search at a time when Google search itself is not doing so hot, frankly. When you do a typical Google search, you first get this kind of generative AI mess, and then you get about 5 sponsored ads, and then you finally get to your actual search. And Google could be pushed to do a little better in that regard. But at the same time, when they're working with their third-party partners, often a lot of that garbage is taken away to actually get to the search result that you're looking for, which the likes of Apple and Samsung and everybody else are happy to pay for. One of the interesting things I found in this story is how Apple actually says, we prefer Google to such an extent that we would not want to work with Bing, which is the number 2 provider, and presumably would do better if this Google search monopoly was broken up. But it seems like Apple actually pays Google a lot of money to do something that they would do anyways. And you would think that Google would want to use that and perhaps say, well, then why do we have to pay you whatever it is, X billion dollars a year to be the preferred search provider when Apple doesn't seem to really want to work with anybody else anyways, or build their own search engine?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure. So two comments. You mentioned Perplexity. I think the Perplexity thing is, again, sort of makes my point that there is plenty of competition. Perplexity also made news. It's funny we didn't happen to capture this, but they also made news that they have announced a pivot where they're focusing more on an advertising-driven model versus a subscription-based model. Mm-hmm. That's clearly a shot across the bow, saying we're coming after you, Google, and we're going to take the same approach. But I think, going to the Apple side of it, and so you're referring to an article that you sent over from Ars Technica, and the part that I thought was interesting, I sort of see Apple's, I mean, I'm a big Apple fan, and if you've been listening, you know that I'm an Apple all through and through. But Apple's still a very savvy company, and I think there's some posturing going on here. They get a boatload of money. I forgot what the 20-40 billion dollars. It's just a staggering amount of money just for flipping this switch and saying Google's the default. So I think some of those statements are posturing, trying to protect that revenue stream. And I think in that article, it talked about how you can almost see this payment as a bribe or as a tribute to keep Apple from competing with them and developing their own, arguably what you would expect to be a much more privacy-centric search engine. So I think that may be the outcome. I think, if this plays out and if they are really struck from it, suddenly Apple says, well, we're not going to get this revenue anyway. We've just made these big investments in Apple Intelligence. That's going to open the door for us re-envisioning search. I could very easily see them go down that road. And being the other 800-pound gorilla that changes it. So, and actually that, from a CIO's perspective, actually could have some ramifications, because now we start thinking about the endpoint ecosystem and where people are interacting, that starts changing it as well. So, this is one of those big macro things that isn't directly in most ways impacting the CIO, and yet there's so many of these threads that I think there's definitely potential.
Yes, I would think that the 2 most practical areas for the CIO to think about are that the CMO's office is going to be affected by whatever changes from a search perspective. So there's going to have to be some changes to the marketing stack, and that is inevitably going to hit the CIO at some point from a data integration and application integration perspective. That is just a very tactical aspect. But the bigger one is, I think, the one that you brought up before, that we have this Google Cloud, which is legitimately the third biggest cloud and increasingly being used as a backup cloud or to help subsidize other AI and cloud capabilities in some way. Google is obviously good at AI, and all of that gets threatened if there's now no longer a revenue source to back all of this, because Google Cloud is not profitable and it has been treated as a growth engine of sorts, although how much anything is a growth engine if it's not profitable is kind of debatable. But be that as it may, Google Cloud is a multi-billion-dollar business at this point and considered a standard IT provider in many ways. Obviously, everything from databases to AI to analytics, being able to develop on Google, all of those things are taken for granted as a capability that a CIO can use and depend on having. We don't expect Google Cloud to disappear tomorrow, but if the funding goes away for Google Cloud all of a sudden, then what happens? There's a not 0% chance that a lot of things get deprecated, because honestly, that is unfortunately a trend that Google is known for. It is hard to predict what they're going to deprecate when they start crunching the numbers and figure out that less than X million people are using any particular service.
Well, it is interesting, and this is sort of why I said in the beginning that I think antitrust laws, particularly in the U.S., are pretty antiquated when it comes to tech. Is that even the biggest, most dominant companies are, I don't want to say easy, but they're by no means impervious from threat. And speaking of that, some of the other news is that Oracle also announced I guess they're calling it their next generation ARM-based cloud compute. And what the connection here is, Oracle was the super dominant player, also got caught sort of unawares of the whole cloud thing. They have now their cloud product, which is running a very distant fourth, and are trying to compete, can't really catch up, but are doing some smart things like this. And they do a lot of these sort of things where they're finding their niche. But the reality is that while they arguably still have a monopoly of sorts in the enterprise database space, they were not infallible. They were not impenetrable. And so this announcement I think is interesting. I'm curious your take on it. I mean, my just off the cuff take on this particular announcement is that what they have seemed to be focusing on and doing a very good job at is really targeting these pragmatic little holes and filling them and saying, this is, we can go do this and we do it really well, and we can do it very cost competitively, and it makes sense for you. You don't have to move all of your workloads to us, but these are the workloads that make a lot of sense to put on our infrastructure.
Yes, the Oracle Ampere A2 launch that they had is basically their cloud compute offering that is focused on scalability and real-time workloads. So those are good targets. Those are things that are hard to support at scale and to do it cheaply. That we see hiccups all the time on people who are messing up real-time video and streaming. And obviously streaming video is an extremely important use case at this point for media companies, and honestly, even everybody else who just wants to keep customers in touch with what they do. When Apple does their conference, or when Salesforce does their conferences, they want real-time video to be able to show key sessions and keynotes. So all of that.
Or when Hyoun wants to watch the Olympics.
Yes, exactly. If you want to watch the Olympics, they were pushing 60, 70, 80 different live streams at massive scale at one time to make that work. And that is not a cheap thing to do. I think it's smart for Oracle to tackle that. And then, of course, for them, it is always about being able to collect that data at the end of the day to use it for something else. Nobody knows the value of data better than Oracle.
Yeah, no, I think I'm often going back to where we started this, I'm often pretty down on Oracle, but they routinely do very smart things to remain relevant and to stay in touch with what they've got. They have a very captive base, and they
Mhm.
they could do. We've seen others that sit there and just treat it as cash cow and try to write it out, and Oracle's clearly not doing that, at least not in its totality, right? They are actively innovating and trying to find ways to be competitive, and they deserve credit for that. And I
Yeah,
think it
and
speaks going all I'm sorry, go on.
yeah, I was just going to say that I feel like a lot of what Oracle has done in the cloud in the past has been very legacy based. So they would host an application and then call it a cloud application. And all of that felt very last generation and really just kind of a me too keeping up with the market type of activity. But this actually feels like tackling price performance more proactively. And I applaud them for that because that's not always the approach that Oracle has taken. They got a little, I would say, lazy in terms of innovating for some time. And it feels like the last few years has really something at Oracle changed. I can't say what it is, but I can say that the Oracle Cloud offering has finally found a niche. Will it get up to the top three? I don't know, but they seem to have at least some specific capabilities that are going to be useful on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. Well, and it goes back to, and I also don't know. I mean, obviously, Larry Ellison is still there at the helm, or at least on paper, and it would, so normally when you see this kind of happen, it's like with Microsoft, right? It was the CEO shift that precipitated all that. And we haven't seen that at Oracle, so it does sort of leave you scratching your head as far as like, well, what is happening beneath the covers that is leading to it. But going all the way back to where we started, the whole antitrust and the competitive landscape in tech and how it changes so quickly, I think it is really, what we were just talking about with Oracle speaks to how difficult it is that every tech company, I don't care how big they are, is struggling to adapt. And Google has largely been playing catch up for the last 2 years since OpenAI sort of came onto the scene and sort of changed everything. Maybe thankfully for Google, OpenAI was relatively slow in really going after search in any meaningful way. Perplexity only now, because Perplexity pretty much doesn't, they use other models. They don't build their own, right? So I mean, they're adapting, and so they had to sort of wait for these foundational models to be good enough for all of this to work. So now there's this threat, but it gave Google a couple of years to react. But the startups themselves also are struggling with this, right? I mean,
Right.
so you showed it. You sent an interesting article over from one of our favorite blogs or analysis out there by a group called AI Supremacy and Michael Spencer. And so, why don't you kind of walk why you thought this particular article was interesting?
Yeah. First of all, the story itself is pretty straightforward. Just talking about how some of OpenAI's uh, key executives are stepping down at a time when OpenAI, frankly, has more competition and risk than ever before. Greg Brockman being the most notable of them as one of the co-founders of OpenAI. But I think this also speaks to the inherent flux that exists in startups. Frankly, OpenAI probably got a ton of money before it had the structure to figure out how to really use that money correctly. So you're seeing what is essentially a baby company with billions of dollars to manage and not a great support or succession planning uh, policy or structure in place. So I think it speaks to how quickly this AI space is changing. That we saw OpenAI a year ago as the undisputed leader in AI, the one company that you could count on to be doing real innovation in AI and pushing a fundamentally different picture of the world. But a lot of competition came up quickly, whether it be Anthropic, Cohere, Perplexity, all these other companies that are doing AI stuff, as well as the big players in the enterprise tech world. So Google, obviously, Microsoft, which invested in AI, OpenAI, but now has started to spread out some of its bets, even companies like Salesforce and Workday and ServiceNow are all coming out with various types of AI models and trying to figure out how they can also provide some of the capabilities that OpenAI has been doing, because nobody wants to be fully dependent on, frankly, a company or an organization that it has this level of flux.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting, and I'm not sure it can. I mean, if you look at where a lot of, I mean, first of all, it is an undeniable exodus. I think, and in fact, almost all of the founding team is gone now, and that's never a good thing. It is, John Schulman went to Anthropic. Greg Brockman is taking a sabbatical, but that's normally code for my next gig. Yeah, so I think what I'm unclear here is, and I don't, these are not mutually exclusive. I think certainly we've heard lots of the sort of water cooler talk about Sam Altman and just being a controversial figure and maybe not being fully up to the task of what's at hand. And like you said, they just and I don't know who would be, frankly, growing from the startup stage to where they are now in this very short period of time. I don't know if there's anyone on the planet that could really truly execute on that. So that's not even a slam, but it's also, I think, just a function of the fact that the AI space, to your point, is changing so quickly that this is some of the most in-demand talent in the universe,
Right.
and so it's hard to imagine a company like OpenAI not getting poached. And it would take a tremendous amount of, force of um, personality, I think, on behalf of the CEO to truly keep those people that engaged. And I think, part of the challenge there is most of this founding team came when OpenAI's mission was really, nonprofit oriented or, goodwill oriented and around building AGI. And OpenAI, you can say what you want about it, but they're now basically an AI product company. And that
Mhm.
means that fundamental mission, that mission driven nature has changed. And so it's not surprising, I think. But it does speak to the broad volatility. And again, if I'm the CIO, I am definitely hedging my bet, because I do think these are, even if all the reasons make sense, all the reasons are justified, it's still warning signs. And these are things that you would then have to be concerned about.
Right. And we're also seeing that the foundational model, frankly, is starting to become less important in the big picture of deploying AI. The model you choose does matter, but we're starting to see that there are ways to be able to plug and play models for certain use cases, and that the actual deployment and front end application associated with the model end up being important as well, and end up almost being completely separate considerations from the foundational model, that regardless of the model you choose on the back end, you still have to make your own separate decisions on the front end, and as from an output perspective. So, but actually speaking there, that irony is that despite all the flux happening at OpenAI, OpenAI still comes up with innovative ideas and products that are pushing the AI market. So, for instance, they recently discussed that they were developing a tool to detect AI generated content. This has been an interesting challenge in the AI world recently, that everybody wants to be able to find AI content, but you seem to have the perspective that this might not exactly be the right angle to be looking at when we think about how to detect AI contact or content, or whether we should even be really trying to do it.
Yeah, I find this particular one to be a red herring. So first of all, I agree with something you said, and we'll talk about other parts of this story in a second, that I think we are increasingly seeing foundational models. I don't want to say not be important, but people are recognizing that there's a lot more to it. And this particular case, I think as far as trying to detect when something is generated by AI is a red herring for two reasons. The first is that AI is still just a tool, and I use lots of tools when I produce content,
Mhm.
including AI. And nobody's asking me or holding against me the fact that I'm using any of these other tools, whether that's Grammarly to check grammar or a word processor to actually, help me structure stuff. I mean, whatever. There's all these tools, and the focus needs to just be on what am I delivering, and does it matter? And the second big thing is everyone is so hyper focused on the generative components, or the ability to produce a piece of prose that Gen AI sort of got started with. But if I look across the landscape of the impactful use cases, it's not even on the list. I mean, that's just a small little piece
Mhm.
of value that it can add. But people that are going to be copying and pasting, they're just lazy. And okay, fine. So if we want to catch this AI plagiarism, fine. I'm all for it. But it's gotten way too much press, in my opinion, for what this really represents.
Yeah, I feel that at the end of the day, plagiarism tends to get caught, whether it is AI created or not. We have a variety of ways to be able to check for plagiarism. And if you have inadvertently plagiarized because you lazily used AI and didn't check your facts beforehand, that at the end of the day, that's on you. So using AI is not an excuse for plagiarism at the end of the day. But I feel like that is going to get caught. I feel like the bigger picture is AI actually helping us to do better work, and that should be the standard. If somebody turns something in, whether it is for a school assignment or a work assignment, the real judgment should be: is this a great paper, or is this a great piece of content? Is this something that is engaging and speaks to the audience that I am talking to? If it is, then that's the real measure at the end of the day. And frankly, I haven't seen AI pour out Shakespeare or pour out a truly inspired ad campaign, one way or the other. So there still needs to be a human touch to it. If AI can get to the point where there doesn't need to be a human touch, that'll be an interesting discussion. But frankly, we're not there yet.
We're not yet. We're not even close to there. And as someone who uses it not only daily but extensively in my work to help me brainstorm ideas, to help me get out of my own boxes, I will tell you flat out, there are times where I have all but, probably never actually completely copy and pasted, but all but where I've taken huge chunks of it and just made minor tweaks. But that's the result of an hour of back and forth with this model, just putting my ideas into it, saying, wait, no, I'm thinking about this. Give me an idea around this idea, right? So the end result of it is still mine, right? I'm just using it to help. And so by the time we get this end product, it's this like collaborative thing. And that's where people get. And so, yeah, I'm sure we have students. I'm sure we have lots of them out there, taking a boring history class and getting, off the shelf history questions and typing it into ChatGPT and getting an answer, copying and pasting. And my attitude on that, well, shame on you as a teacher if you're giving a question that is that easily answerable by a Gen AI bot today. Then that's on you.
Mhm.
So look, I think I have no problem with transparency, but I just think it's focused on the wrong parts. But anyway, we spent too much time on that. You alluded to the shift that we're seeing, and I think it's incredibly important on a bunch of different fronts. And it manifested in a couple of news stories, but one of which was a company called Groq, not that Groq, that raised $640 million, specifically focusing on the need to increase performance of inference. Which, if you're not fully up to speed on the way the AI stuff works, you have the process. There's two big processes. There's the training of the models, and then there's applying those models, that process we call inference, to actually generate a result of some sort. And we spend so much time and energy talking about training of the models, but there is a heck of a case to be made that the real battle is going to be fought on your ability to drive inference, particularly because that's where you start injecting your proprietary data into it and other elements of it. So I'm curious what your take on this and how you see this sort of playing out.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about this one. Although it can be overwhelming sometimes to just see these numbers. Right now, if you aren't getting $600 million for your AI service, is it even worth pursuing? That's what it feels like sometimes. These numbers are just amazing to consider. But that aside, there is this massive challenge of trying to figure out how to align models to use cases and to actually make sure that you are able to support use cases at scale. And at the end of the day, that requires inference, to be able to use models in production. So I think Groq is working on the right problem in terms of what CIOs should actually be worried about. Frankly, the focus on foundational models and which model is 1% better than the other model is going to be this long-standing war that is going to keep going on week after week, month after month, year after year, and we are going to see headlines literally every other day for the foreseeable future on which model is better. But the real answer for the CIO is you just have to choose a model, make sure that it works for your use case as a proof of concept, and then deal with the actual problem of putting it into production. And that's where Groq is focusing. And it's great that there's actual money going into that as well as just the models and the training.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, in my opinion, unless you are JP Morgan Chase, and by the way, if you're the CIO of JPMC and you're listening to our podcast, please let us know because we'd love to talk to you. But unless that's who you are, you're not going to be out building anything remotely close to a foundational model. That's not where you're going to be able to make any difference, right? You're going to make a difference in one of two ways. You're going to take the Databricks Snowflake type approach where you're building a small language model that is proprietary using your data, or the difference is going to come in your ability to drive inference and your ability to do it rapidly and be able to integrate other elements of your data set into it to create contextual awareness and something that is unique to your business process and your models and what have you. And so that's where this battle is going to get fought. And so I love this story. And I think we're also seeing that it's not just about AI, right? Because all of this is built on the foundation of workflows and data, and that data has to be reliable, and we need to understand what we're dealing with. And these have been hairy problems that have been challenging enterprise IT for a very long time. And so another article that you pulled out, which I would have missed entirely, I can never say their name, but a company called KNIME, is that how it's
KNIME, the German company, yeah.
So they just raised, so they're a 20 some odd year old company, right? And they just raised $30 million to focus on this sort of core building block technology around data and data analytics. Now it's 30, not 300 million. That's the difference, I guess, when we're talking in scale. But what was your read on this announcement? Because I think this goes back to the same idea that it's about the building blocks and the blocking and tackling.
Yeah, I was really surprised by this because I've covered KNIME for many years. They're like RapidMiner or Alteryx to some extent. They provide these analytic workflows and support data science and data pipelines to be able to support machine learning and AI use cases. So pretty straightforward there. But because these other solutions have become less open source over time, there's now this opening in the market again for a truly open source analytic pipeline solution to exist, and frankly for other companies to build services and applications on top of it. So even in the year of our Lord 2024, a good decade plus after these predictive analytics solutions, a lot of other predictive analytic solutions were getting funding, KNIME is still here and getting a $30 million funding round at this point. It just happens to be the right point for their business to be able to grow further. And it also speaks to the fact that we like to say that business intelligence is over, predictive analytics is over. But if you have the right set of capabilities in your product, it almost doesn't matter whether your timing is right or whether you are on the cusp or on the wave of the next big thing. Sometimes just being part of the last big thing but doing it better is the right way to go.
Well, it goes to what we've been talking about for a long time, and that is, yes, AI sucks up all the air out of the room, but the vast majority of what the average enterprise IT organization is focused on a day-to-day basis has nothing to do with any of that. It's based on all this blocking and tackling and executing and figuring out how to solve some of these problems that have been plaguing the IT organization for decades, generations now. And in fact, we have two articles that we will wrap up on that sort of talk about two of those things. And I'm really curious I brought one of the articles, you brought the other, and so I'm curious your take on them. But one is this idea of succession planning. Now, this article was actually about how Intel, and we talked about them last week, and all the challenges they're going through. And this article is sort of making the case about what they call, I've never heard this, the 4 wrong CEO rule. But you made the case offline that well, it probably applies to a CIO too. And when you said that, it's like a light bulb went off. Yeah, okay, I can see this. So this idea of succession planning, something that CIOs have been super, super bad at historically. And then the other one is an article from CIO that honestly is a bit of a nothing burger article, but it's just talking about the fact that despite all this stuff going on, despite the impact that we're seeing around things like tech debt, that CIOs still are not making it a priority, and they're not dealing with it. And these are, going all the way back to the data analytics side, right? This is the stuff that is consuming so much energy. And those CIOs that get this sort of blocking and tackling right, are the ones that are making a difference. So I'm curious. I know why I brought up my article, but why? What did the Intel one say to you?
Yeah. So for the first article you mentioned brings up that basically 4 CEOs, the concept that 4 CEOs, bad CEOs, can mess up a company. Bring up Intel as an example. So we've been talking for a while now about the chip wars and how Intel is unfortunately struggling. They've had their layoffs and all of this, but that honestly, if you ask people in tech, does Intel have a good CEO right now? Most of them would still say yes. His the background that he has running VMware and his prior record as an Intel executive showed that he has the right stuff to be able to actually run Intel, but he is dealing with the business debt, the decision debt of multiple bad executives that were in the middle that have ended up messing up Intel's growth capabilities. And I feel that that has been a challenge across the board that is hidden in other companies because we don't necessarily track CFOs, CIOs, CMOs in quite the same way. But it can be easy for a streak of bad executives in one area to really tank a company. And I think that's something that's important to look at the CIO level because we often, frankly, it's amazing to see how many CIOs have gotten their job almost accidentally. They were not on a career track to become the CIO, but they became the CIO either because the company needed them or they were transferred from the CFO or some other executive position to help clean up the IT office. And that lack of strategy associated with the CIO office can be a real challenge because we are in a digital age where the strategic view on technology is now part of the long-term valuation of a company. And so there should always be some way to figure out who should the next CIO be, whether that's an internal candidate or an external candidate. There should always be somebody in mind for who's got next and in a worst case scenario.
Well, and that what I found so fascinating when we each brought these 2 separate articles, and as I sort of processed them, is how truly interconnected they are. Because in the case of a CIO, what is a bad CIO going to do? Probably going to accumulate a whole bunch of tech debt that then, as gosh, I just forgot her name, but she wrote a book the time that my first book came out, and she described tech debt as the albatross hanging around the neck of the current CIO, decisions that were made, and it's ironic, I think she said 3 or 4 CIOs prior, right? And that's what happens. And that's what, I mean, not all tech debt is that. Part of it's just the velocity and whatever, but a lot of tech debt is that I'm making these expedient decisions in the moment and not really looking at that strategic view. And it's an interesting question. Does a CIO have the same level of impact that a CEO does? Can a CIO, 4 bad CIOs, in fact, tank a company? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I will know. I will say that I am 100% sure that 4 bad CIOs can absolutely cripple a company, absolutely tie their hands and make it almost impossible for them to compete, and where they're just sort of then having to kind of move along and hope that something changes. So I think it's really interesting, and if you're a CIO listening to this, my big takeaway is you need that strategic perspective. You need to be looking at this. You need to be tackling some of this historical legacy tech debt, whatever you want to call it. But that you're actively looking to the future and saying, what does my architecture, what is my environment, what does my culture need to look like, so that you don't become one of the chain of 4 bad CIOs that leads to the crippling of your company.
Yes. And one of the biggest challenges across for the CIO, of course, is technical debt as well. So this idea that you will be hindered by technical debt is not a new one for the CIO. Everybody talks about technical debt, but oddly, I feel like it's one of these topics that ends up getting a lot of lip service rather than a lot of activity. And often the challenge around technical debt ends up being turned into whether companies should move to the cloud or not. And it kind of starts and ends there rather than a more holistic perspective of what does up-to-date technology look like and how do we keep from being siloed into all of these different areas or choosing a bunch of interesting functional best-in-breed solutions that don't play well together, or choosing a bunch of strategic vendors that may not work well together at the end of the day.
Well, and I think what is interesting, going all the way back, and this is why I love that you brought this article forward, and it helped me sort of think through it, is that the reason that tech that gets that is the can that keeps getting kicked down the road, is that it's really hard to get political credit for changing the oil, which is sort of what this is the equivalent of when we talk about tech debt. You end up modernizing, you end up refreshing, and the end state is you rarely are delivering any new functionality and any new value to the business on the surface. And so I think, if I were to go back and look in this article that you had several examples, um, it is that sort of short-sightedness that causes those problems. It's not that they're bad people, they're dumb people, they're clearly not. It's that they fail to see the longer term strategic ramifications of an opportunity that they were presented. And it's often rooted in, I'm a big fan of the late Clayton Christensen's work around disruptive innovation and sustaining innovation, and how you end up in a large enterprise in this conflict because you are encouraged and incentivized to protect your current state. And so, I think that we see these sort of situations, and those that are successful in breaking the tech debt cycle, in driving that sort of change, are the ones that are able to take these things that are the oil changes, that the stuff that just you got to get done, but you're not getting political credit for, and transform them, to put them in a wrapper where it is in fact something that is meaningful to the business and therefore can get funding and can actually have an appreciable impact within the organization. And that's a challenge, but it's a whole lot easier said than done. And that's but I think that's what separates the wheat from the chaff on this.
Yeah, and I think there's these two important buckets to keep in mind, and you need to be able to get credit for both of them. One is around sustainable innovation and sustained support, as well as that transformative change. From a financial perspective, our firm, Amalgam Insights, talks about the IT rule of 30, which says that any unmanaged IT spend category typically has about 30% in waste. But that's considered kind of ongoing, sustainable operations. Nobody really gets credit for cutting costs by 20 or 30%. The other side is that sometimes there are these opportunities to cut costs 70, 80, 90% in tech, but that usually means that you are changing something where you have a lot of technical debt. What it really means is that you are 2 or 3 generations behind in that particular area. And then, yes, you have this 90% opportunity. And ironically, sometimes you'll get more credit for that 90% savings, but that 90% savings actually means that you've been doing a bad job for a decade.
At least somebody has. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So sometimes you have to position that 20% as being better in some ways, because it means that you have been doing a decent job, but just fell a little behind. Whereas the 90% stuff typically means you are cleaning up a big mess, probably from 3 CIOs ago.
Exactly. So hopefully those are the words of wisdom if you're a CIO that cause you to step back and take a fresh look at all this, because this is the important stuff. So I think it's a great way to end it.
Excellent. On that note, thank you so much for showing up for our discussion on the most interesting news and stories and perspectives of the week. If you've got anything else you'd like for us to consider, please feel free to comment or to email us. And as always, like, subscribe, and share with your friends if you found this interesting. We look forward to catching up with you next week.